Hello, folks. Another week. Welcome back to World War II TV. And we have a kind of variety of shows coming at you this week. Nothing, in fact, tomorrow on a Tuesday. If you're new to the channel, a number of new people found me last week because of the discussions about the atomic bombs. Welcome aboard. Don't forget to click subscribe and get all the notifications coming in, and all the description, all the information you need is in the description below. But this is the first of, I'm hoping to be quite a regular series, kind of filling up gaps when I perhaps haven't got another show, of Normandy Myth Busters. So we're going to bring various people on. Niels is going to do one. I think Stephen Fisher wants to do one at some point, and we'll kind of examine some of these established Normandy stories, legends, whatever you want to call them, and try and examine them a bit like the one we did a year and a half ago now about John Steele in San Mariglis, which brings me to my guest, Marty Morgan, Martin K.A. Morgan, depending on which book and or magazine article you read. You name it, he's written for every single magazine going, appeared numerous times as a talking head on TV shows, and has been on World War II TV. And I'm delighted to bring him back in to discuss this whole, was there a Korean soldier on Omaha Beach? That is the question we're putting. So I'm going to bring Marty in this afternoon. So good afternoon, Marty. How are you?
I am great. Thank you for having me on the show once again.
So, well, thank you. And this is one of those stories that, you know, someone in the sidebar a minute ago said, is this based on this movie? And if it was just the movie, that would be kind of interesting enough. But this is a story that has just like kind of ivy growing and over a building has just crept everywhere on the internet. It comes up on my Facebook feed as regularly as the "Did you know James Doohan from Star Trek was on Juno Beach?" which keeps being broken, that story, as a news story like twice a week for about the last 20 years. So the Korean on Omaha Beach is what we're going to look at. And the way we're going to do this, folks, is kind of, I'm the kind of judge, in a sense. Marty is the counsel for the prosecution, the lawyer for the prosecution, and you viewers are the jury. At the end of this discussion, after Marty has presented his evidence, I will kind of maybe consider it, then we'll put it over to the viewers, and you can decide whether or not you think this story has legs or not. So how did you first hear about the story? Before we get into your presentation, when did it first pop up on your radar, Marty?
The first time I was aware of it was when I read this book when I was working on my master's degree in the 1990s. Then I had no idea at the time that I read it. I passed it over because it's a quick mention in the Ambrose book. I did not, at the time that I read it, understand that my future would involve working for Stephen Ambrose, and that after Dr. Ambrose's death in 2002, I would go to his house, pull all of his research material out of his house, and move it to the museum, and that then I would, from that point forward, remain in charge of his research collection. I didn't hear about the story again until about 2005, when the Korean Embassy of the United States of America reached out to me and asked me to come up with some information supporting Dr. Ambrose's claim from the book. At that point, since I was the person in charge of the Ambrose research collection, I went through absolutely everything, and I found what I believe to be the source code on this entire thing, which was an oral history interview from a paratrooper, coincidentally from 506 Parachute Infantry, named Robert Brewer. He was a lieutenant, a platoon leader. And in response to this request from the Korean Embassy, I went through the entirety of the Ambrose collection and found that there was but one reference and one reference alone, and it was this oblique reference in the Bob Brewer oral history personal account. And it was based on that this entire empire has been built.
And also we ought to do a kind of a caveat that part of the explanation for where we are is the generalization of all American and British veterans, of anybody of basically Asian appearance, just being grouped into just Asiatic, be they Japanese, Korean, Siberian, Chinese. The world wasn't like it is now, where we understand that there's all these different backgrounds and identities and cultures. Back then, if you were of Asiatic appearance, people used terms. We're not going to use those terms tonight, except we will reference the shortening of the word Japanese in official photographic, what's the one with captions. But a lot of this comes out of this misidentity, mislabeling of people who were of a different appearance to white folks fighting in a war, I suppose, is the easy way saying?
The argument that I advance here is that in order to identify the ethnic origin of the person that's in the famous photograph, it's necessary to have a pretty sophisticated understanding of history dating back to the 14th century, and it's also necessary to be a bit of an ethnographer. And the argument that I make is that the people who were on the scene fighting the battle in northern France in 1944, they were not ethnographers. They were ill-equipped to identify the ethnic origin of these people that they were encountering. And as you well know, they were encountering lots of different people from the Soviet Transcaucasian republics, the Soviet Central Asian republics, and they were, as in this case, they were encountering people from East Asia as well. And those people, not equipped with the skills to understand the ethnic origin of these people, they were pretty quick to provide verdicts about where they came from.
Yeah, exactly. So you have come armed with a lot of photos, which today, folks, we are treating as exhibits. That is the formula of the show. We'll bring it up. And so this is the title of my graphic, A Korean at Omaha Beach. That is pulled out of that famous photo, which for today's purposes is Exhibit A. So I'm going to kind of hand over to you, Marty, and explain this is where it all comes from. This is the photo that accompanies all the various internet articles and magazine articles about this gentleman who has been referred to as in this photo here. So I'll let you go through these exhibits and build your case. And then if you have questions, folks, fire away, and I will jump in with my comments, and we'll just examine this. So over to you, Marty.
Thank you, Your Honor. If it please the court, I would call the jury and your Honor's attention to Prosecution Exhibit A. And what you're seeing here is the famous photo that has started it all. The photo that launched 1,000 ships, I guess you could say. What this photo presents to us is a person of obvious East Asian origin, or perhaps Central Asian origin, being interrogated after being captured as a prisoner of war. And that is all we know. An interesting point I'd like to make about this photograph is that the caption that is provided, and if I could call Your Honor's attention to Prosecution Exhibit B, where you'll see there is a caption provided. It's a caption that, I don't know how you feel about it, but I call captions like this worthless because it provides no information as to time or place. All we know is Normandy, summer of 44. Thanks, guys. A lot of help. But the reason that I'm calling attention to this specifically is that I have just survived a basically 2-decade stretch of my life during which I'm constantly and continuously arguing about this photo, arguing with people who are convinced that this person's Korean, that this person is a named individual, which, as I will ultimately reveal as I make my case to Your Honor, is absolutely no basis in fact whatsoever. The way that it circulates this day and age is that the person in the photograph is revealed through social media posts constantly and continuously as being a man identified as Yang Kyoungjong. There's a Wikipedia page that establishes some background for him, and absolutely every bit of it is complete falsehood. There is absolutely no proof whatsoever that any Koreans served in German uniform during the Second World War, let alone specifically in Normandy. There is absolutely no proof whatsoever that any human being lived to serve in the German military named Yang Kyoungjong. If you follow the Wikipedia page narrative of Yang Kyoungjong's life, he is a person who ultimately died while living in the state of Illinois in the Chicago area in 1992. And there is absolutely, positively no truth whatsoever to that contention either. The interesting detail now is that Yang Kyoungjong's Wikipedia page, which is central to the argument that I'd like to build today, and we'll get to that later. But the point I'd like to make is that the Wikipedia page for the supposed Yang Kyoungjong now even includes a disclaimer indicating that the Koreans have concluded that he is a person who never existed and that the story is a falsehood. So this story was ultimately, the story that is recited in the Ambrose DDay book ultimately becomes attached to that story. And if you move then on, if you would please, to Prosecution Exhibit C.
And just before we do, I want to just mention the fact that A, your phone is pinging, but no, B, is that
right now.
We know it's early in Normandy because of the semicircular marking on the M1 helmet there, which is an engineer brigade. It restricts it to Utah or Omaha, and it pretty much restricts it to the early couple of days, because you don't, I mean, not really, because their engineer brigades do move on, but it's kind of not August, is it? I mean, that theoretically, I mean, that's the only thing that I can see in that gives us any suggestion that it is early-ish in June.
Right. And a point that I would make too is that we get no help from the caption. So you're on Exhibit B right now, where you can see the caption is worthless and not helpful. If you move onward from there to Prosecution Exhibit C, you'll see, which is an actual link to the photograph from the National Archives and Records Administration. You'll see that provides absolutely no useful information either. The presence of the Engineer Special Brigade helmet is absolutely critical. And you can't tell because you can't determine the color because it's a black and white photograph, but it's either what is it, fifth or sixth Engineer Special Brigade, which identifies it to Omaha. But a factor that adds, I think, a level of an interesting twist and a little bit of confusion to the matter is that, I don't want to jump ahead, but Prosecution Exhibit L depicts a soldier of either the 5th or 6th Engineer Special Brigade interrogating a German prisoner of Central Asian origin and La Haye Dupuis. And I believe that photograph is even dated to June 21st. So the famous photograph here that begins the entire Yang Kyoungjong mythology is a photograph where we have no declared location, no declared time. I have found versions of the photograph at the archives that use the date June 21st. However, as you've probably experienced, I frequently find Normandy photos that are definitely from June 6th or 7th. And it's just that the date associated with it is a release date when it was cleared to be released to the public. And so it will be sometime after June 6th or 7th.
They're the ones that are perhaps not quite as interesting. They're not ones of immediate combat and tanks and things coming off landing craft. So they don't get put out in the first editions. They kind of get stacked up somewhere. And I think that's when they come out later, 3 weeks later, when they're looking for some news stories. Now, didn't we have that photo? That'll do. So it comes out a bit later. That's my kind of theory behind some of those later releases of some D-Day photos.
Right. And there's that entire engine that begins turning, that the Office of War Information is a machine that's cycling, and they're constantly in need of photos. And if there's one thing that I have learned from what I have studied about combat photographers associated with the June 6 landings, is that they encountered a lot of unexpected difficulties, and they turned in far less in terms of photographic content than was expected. All that did was make this hunger for more content even more powerful, which is why I think you have these cases of early June 6th and 7th photos being released a little bit later on. But if you're interested in moving on to the next exhibit, Prosecution Exhibit D as in dog, is what I call the source code. This is the page from Stephen Ambrose's book where the story is laid out for the first time. And I put it in there. So if people want to read that while we're talking, we could. Well, I'll let people read it while we're talking. But that's the source. That is the acorn from which this oak tree. I'm moving on from ivy to oak trees now. Story has grown, but it's not very much, is it? No, it's essentially not. It's not. And I love to point out the fact that my personal involvement in this story, which is the point in 2005 when the Korean embassy reached out to the museum and I was the person that took the task. The way that I tracked down what the Koreans were interested in, they wanted to know where Dr. Ambrose got the story. I went to the book. I pulled up the appropriate page, which is page 34 in the first edition printing of the book. And Ambrose he didn't really give me much to go on, because you'll notice the appalling absence of a footnote there.
Yep.
Ain't no damn footnote on that page.
Yep.
However, he does reference Brewer, which is the point at which, as I was trying to find something, I scoured the entire collection. There's not a mention of Koreans. I saw the Brewer reference. I dug into the Brewer oral history to the point where I found the version of the story. And what Dr. Ambrose has done here is something that he was a little notorious for, which is something also that he got himself in a little bit of trouble for later on. And that is that Brewer described the events, and Ambrose, rather than quoting Brewer, Ambrose creates an abstract of the Brewer story, the way if you told me at Oak and I went to tell somebody the next day, we would use some of the same words. It would be largely the same, but it would be a little bit different. And that's what Ambrose has done here. And so after combing through the entire Ambrose collection, which is a significant collection and a collection that belonged to another era, an entirely analog era, I went through absolutely everything, and the only thing I came up with was with Brewer. And so Ambrose has basically recapitulated and produced an abstract of the Brewer version of events. And as the prosecution will argue over the course of this trial, Brewer was not an ethnographer. Brewer was not a person who understood keenly or in a sophisticated way the 14th century Turco-Mongol amalgamation, which was this 14th century ethno-cultural synthesis that led to East Asian people spreading all the way to the Caucasus, beyond the Caspian to the Black Sea. He was not a person who was well equipped to provide the appropriate verdict of where this person came from. And what that leads me to suspect, I have no proof to support this because Brewer continues to be inconveniently no longer alive. I believe that Brewer probably just pulled that story from the scuttlebutt that would have been circulating around the troops. And somebody came up with Korean.
Don Baguette in Courrier Screaming Eagle in Normandy refers to Japanese or Asiatic troops somewhere up near Marmion Farm or Raveneville or somewhere. And it's one of those things when you're reading it, you don't even notice it. You just move on and you realize, you think he's obviously referring to Osperton somewhere, but there's not enough information there. So you kind of skip on. But while we got that text up there, the judge wants to kind of just mention the fact there's a lot of very woolly language in that. The first bit is, it was learned later they were Koreans, without explaining who learned what from whom. Then there's it seems they had been conscripted. So that's very, very vague. Then later on, it's what happened to them. We never found out, but presumably they were sent back to Korea. So there's no definite verdict there. They would almost certainly have been conscripted. So no definite. It's all very woolly. There's nothing in there really pointing to anything definitive. It's all just an author trying to pull something out of a story when he doesn't have the information. That's what I see when I read that paragraph.
And Stephen Ambrose was notorious for doing that. I continue to admire Stephen Ambrose's work, while I continue also to criticize it heavily. Stephen Ambrose did more for this subject than I have ever done or ever will do. At the same time, he, like me, is a human being and is therefore fallible, and he made mistakes. And this book at this point now, I mean, it's so old. This is a very old book, and it's dated, and it has problems. That doesn't mean that it should be dismissed. This is part of growing, vibrant historiography. And I should point out, too, by the way, that when I pulled this out last night, it interested me very much that this Post-it note that's on here is a Post-it note that I put on the book in 2005 when I was going through the collection trying to find references to the Koreans or the Korean embassy. And there's some evidence there of when I did this, at the point at which I joined this story. And just to put it in a proper perspective, one quick example of Ambrose notoriously sort of jumping to conclusions is that I had a fascinating interaction that I think you're going to find very interesting, Paul. And it was a couple of years ago before COVID, because as you know, I continue to lead tours in Normandy and I continue to work with Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. And Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours has been using the same bus drivers, some of the same bus drivers, since it began in 1989. And there's this one older bus driver, and the two of us were chatting on a trip about Ambrose, and he mentioned this reference to this other big piece of mythology that I would like to disassemble one of these days, this idea that Rommel left Normandy to go home for his wife's birthday, which is absolutely false. And there's absolutely no basis of truth to it whatsoever. And the driver told me this interesting story of how he was leading a tour, how Ambrose was leading a tour at some point in the early 90s. This man was the driver. They went to Ulm. They went to Rommel's grave. And while they were standing over Rommel's grave, Ambrose sort of, told a little bit of Rommel history. And he looked, and there was the grave of Rommel's wife right next to him. And he went, look, she died. Her birthday, she was born on June 6th. That's why he was away from his headquarters. That's why he left. And my argument is that on the basis of that, we have built this industry, this mythology about Rommel leaving his headquarters to go home for his wife's birthday. And it was sort of Ambrose kind of taking on the role of, I'm a detective, that I'm going to figure these things out. And sometimes he jumped to conclusions that were not safe conclusions at all, as he has done in this example.
Now, this is going down a potential rabbit hole, but when I was looking into this Rommel story, and we can do that as another show later on, at least one ancestry site, just to throw this in there, lists Mrs. Rummel's birthday as May the 6th.
May the 6th. I noticed that. I caught that myself.
So, I mean, I'm not saying which is right or wrong. I'm just saying there is other evidence suggests it's May the 6th. So, well, there's a subject for a second Normandy myth busting show is the whole birthday thing. But people are asking, as I would expect, they're asking about Stephen Ambrose's research process. Did he use researchers? Did he cross-check stuff? And I'll let you respond to that. But I'm guessing about the same as every high-profile author does. Everybody, basically, it's the author's final say. Yes, some authors use more research than others. Some do all their work themselves. But whether you're back Max Hastings in the 80s or Carlo D'Este's in the 80s or James Holland, Peter Caddick Adams now, ultimately, it's everything filters through the author, the historian himself. So no matter what researchers did or didn't do, it goes in the book if the author gives it the go ahead and puts it in his text. So I don't think we can blame researchers for not doing their job on this. Any error, it says it in the beginning of most of the books, is any error is mine and mine alone. Most authors say, don't they? So I think we can keep the researchers out of it at the moment. What's your take on that?
Yeah, my take on it is I was sort of within the inner circle of the family there for the last 2 years of his life. And I was there after his death and when we transitioned everything from the home to the museum. And I was there sort of not taking over and filling his shoes, but trying to at least. And a criticism that has been thrown out time and time again, because he was accused of plagiarism shortly before his death, was that Ambrose had a team working for him, and it involved all these researchers, and the researchers were doing all the work, and he was simply putting his name to it. That is definitely not what happened. I was around that family enough to know that is not the way that it worked. He was doing all the writing himself. He had some assistance, but the assistance that he had was in the form of a group of people from the University of New Orleans who were working at the Eisenhower Center, and they were mainly transcriptionists. So that where he did have an office full of people busily working away on a daily basis, they were receiving things like cassette recordings of veteran interviews. A reality, too, that I have to confess about the Ambrose story is that people imagined Stephen Ambrose having conducted all of the oral history interviews that were included in this book. And the reality here is that Dr. Ambrose, he interviewed very, very few people. What he did, though, was he, like Cornelius Ryan had a generation before, he put out a call for veterans to send in personal accounts. And he even, to sort of, to make it easier for them, using a method that Cornelius Ryan couldn't because the technology wasn't available, Ambrose said, well, just use a cassette recorder and answer the questions that are on this list of questions. He provided a questionnaire the way that Cornelius Ryan had. He, in many ways, just copied a technique that Cornelius Ryan had employed, except then he encouraged them to use a cassette recorder, which a very large number of them did. They sent the material in, and then those cassettes had to be transcribed. That's where there was a group of people. When it came to research and writing, it was entirely Ambrose by himself.
Yeah, well, that's not surprising at all. Yeah, the Rommel discussion is getting a whole lot of activity on the sidebar. We'll do that in another show, folks. Let's stick with Omaha Beach. But people love the idea of things that they think as being a set in stone fact as actually not being quite as set in stone as we thought they were. It's just, I think it's like catnip to people. It's just, really? I've always thought that. And I've always been suspicious about the Rommel one. But getting back to, so we've got this text there from the Ambrose's book, which is similar to the John Steele thing we did about Samuel. There's not very much from which this is all grown. So should we move on now to Exhibit E?
Exhibit E, I offer to you as a means of conveying why I think this story is important. Over the years, people have asked me, like, why do you even care? What does it matter? I find, too, that when this gets posted on social media, there was a time when I used to push back on it, and people would just go out of their way to attack me viciously. And they would often be very mean and hurt my feelings. And they would question, like, why do you care? It's a great story. Why are you pushing back? And I'm using Exhibit E as a means of showing you why we need to care about this story. These are photographs of an exhibit panel that's in Memorial du Camp. And an argument that I am making here today is that the reason that we need to be concerned about this story is that because as this story has grown legs, as this story began to circulate in the pre-social media era, it eventually circulated to an extent that it was added to the exhibits at that museum. And my argument is that when it appears in a book by a famous historian, everyone assumes it's got to be true. And then when they see it on the wall at a popular museum, they're going to think it's true. And in fact, when I bring up my skepticism about this story, people very quickly go, well, it's in the Ambrose book. Or they will say, oh, yeah, but it's in the exhibits in Mémorial du Camp. And you heard it here first. Just because it's in a book and just because it's in a museum doesn't mean it's true.
Yeah. I mean, we can see why we're going down another rabbit hole in the era of people involved in museums trying to bring in as many audiences from around the world. People are traveling from all over the world. Any attempt to make D-Day and the Battle of Normandy an international event, I'm thoroughly behind that. I'm thoroughly behind the idea of acknowledging that minorities involved from the Allied point of view. The Germans were not just Germans. There was Poles and Estonians and Latvians and Paswold, go on. All that is great. But if you're doing that, at least base it on stories that have substance and verification and so on. It's I can understand why people are falling into the traps. And we're all of us, I'm going to admit, I get suckered into stories sometimes. I get suckered into the idea of, that I've met veterans who've turned out to be fakes. And when they start talking, you start going, oh my God, this is brilliant. And you start very easily just buying what they say because you want the scoop. All of us want this idea of being there when the person is, unburdening themselves of a story from 70, 80 years ago. And so something new is exciting, but we have to be strict with ourselves and make sure we don't allow our imagination to run away with the facts. But we've now established that this isn't just a story that goes around on Facebook groups. It's in books and it's in museums.
Right. And as we move on from this prosecution exhibit to the next one, this is the sort of the most important piece of evidence, I think, in many ways, because there is what we call an historicity to this story, meaning that I can trace developments of this story from point of origin to where we are today. And along the way, I can trace that because I have looked. It is a bit challenging, just like trying to find somebody it would be like prove to me that the Loch Ness Monster doesn't exist. I don't even know where to begin. With this story, I know where to begin. It began with Ambrose. I have attempted to find references to Koreans in Normandy. Prior to that, I have found nothing. And it is not for a lack of trying, because I've been living with this story for almost 2 decades now. Ambrose introduces the story. The story begins to circulate. The story is then picked up by the museum. It becomes a museum exhibit. And this is a part of this further branching out of the fission that's created by this story. And then importantly, eventually, this Wikipedia page is created. And if you'll move on to the next piece of prosecution exhibit, you'll notice that this is the bottom of the updates page for the Wikipedia page for Yang Kyoungjong. And if you look all the way down at the bottom, you will see the point at which that page was created, which is in October of 2012. An argument that I am making here, and I am advancing that to Your Honor on the basis that this story has grown, and we can track and trace the way that it has grown. We can empiricize it from its point of origin in Ambrose in the book that came out in 2004 to the point where it is added to a museum exhibit, to the point where it becomes a Wikipedia page. And whoever created this Wikipedia page, you can see the name there. When they created that Wikipedia page in October 2012, they just created a name. I am convinced, and I hope to convince Your Honor over the course of this trial, that they did this as a means of basically pulling a prank. Just like back in the 80s when the Hitler diaries emerged, or 10 years ago when the Nazi gold train emerged. There are people out there that are doing this, I think, as a part of a prank. There are people that are doing it for reasons of self-promotion, self-aggrandizing reasons of becoming the person who sits on top of the big scoop. Whatever the case, whoever created the Wikipedia page for Yang Kyoungjong is a person that cannot be found. And by that same token, Yang Kyoungjong cannot be found. The Koreans themselves even confess to the fact that they can find no information that can establish that as being a person who actually ever lived.
Wow. I mean, and if you search his name, folks, and I would encourage all the jury to just do a Google search of his name while you're watching. A whole raft of things come up. I'm looking right now. Anthony Beaver comes up. Famouspeople.com. Where's another one I just found there a minute ago? Nationalpost.com. CuriousHistories.net. MilitaryHistoryFandom.com. allthat'sinteresting.com. There are all sorts of sites that have this story listed in some shape or form. So it's gone from book to museums to Wikipedia. And let's not forget, folks, what Wikipedia is. It is a very important, very useful tool, but it is created by the users. It's a strange, it's very useful, but we can't treat it in the same way as we treat like a national archive, I think.
Right. And the Yang Kyoungjong Wikipedia page is the perfect proof of that, because it is built entirely on falsehood. There is absolutely no truth whatsoever to this idea that a Yang Kyoungjong ever lived. And yet here we have a Wikipedia page. I think Wikipedia is very useful. The other day, I wanted to figure out what day Mozart died. And Wikipedia is great for that.
Yeah, simple facts. Yeah,
simple facts. There are other things that it's not so great at. And as you have already observed, it troubles me to watch the way that the story continues to grow and expand, because it's much bigger than I am and much bigger than I will ever be. And it has reached a level now where it has been reified by historians that I know and respect. A big one is that Anthony Beaver uses Yang Kyoungjong, a person who never existed, that's based entirely on a Wikipedia page that was not created until 2012. He uses him as sort of the grandest metaphor at the beginning of his big book about D-Day. And he introduces the Yang Kyoungjong character in the absolute opening paragraph of that book with this idea of this person proves that the scale of the Second World War was absolutely massive, and that the global conflict could create circumstances like the unusual case of this Korean who was conscripted into the Japanese army and captured by the Russians, and then captured by the Germans, and then captured by the Americans. And Beaver went forward with this, and there are even some interesting interviews where Beaver was called on to comment about it, because most interviewers, when the book came out, they maybe read the first couple of pages and they didn't read the whole book, and they didn't have much to talk about. And they went with Yang Kyoungjong because it was interesting and it was dynamic and it was I don't know what to say here.
Different. It's just simply different. It's just it presents things from a slightly different, unusual angle. And when we're talking about the Battle of Normandy, if you're trying to do a new book about it now, trying to angle it in a way that it doesn't just sound like you're talking about something that's been talked about before is very difficult. So your angle is, it was all about the civilians, it was all about the cover up of this, and you've got to try and find something. So yeah, I can understand why this is being used to lead stories on the internet, because it is inherently interesting. People go, oh wow, that's incredible, this guy was in 4 different armies theoretically. This guy that we're is on the stand, or would be on the stand if he was alive to take the stand, if he existed potentially to take the stand. It is a fascinating character.
That he is. And it fascinates me too, because what I think this is the greatest example of is a larger intellectual concept that has been described in the past as Orientalism or Exoticism, or as it related specifically to Germany, was esotericism. These ideas of these obscure facts that call you into a meditation about something bigger and something more substantial. And I think Yang Kyoungjong is the perfect example of this exoticism, the idea of something very novel, something very different, something that has not inhabited the inner circle of the conversations that we've been having. And I get it, because I continue to cling to this pathetic dream that one of these days I might write another book, and I keep pitching books to publishers and they don't want anything to do with the ideas that I want to write about. And it's just nothing but one disappointment after the other, because I'm wanting to talk about things like this, and I'm wanting to talk about things like paratroopers and D-Day or U-boats in the Gulf of Mexico, and they feel it all very boring because it lacks this esoteric or exotic quality, where if I could come up with something novel like Yang Kyoungjong, I might be able to get a book contract again one of these days. But they're not buying what I am selling. And the type of reality that we're offering here, this idea of adjusting mythologies and dismissing these mythologies because it's important to do so. I don't think publishers are interested in that because I don't think people buy those books and read them.
Yeah. And I'm sorry that you're not able to get a book contract because you've done some fantastic work in the past. And B, the other thing about even if whatever decision is made by our jury today, it's not going to make a difference. It's pissing in the wind. We're not going to stop these internet articles carrying on. All that will happen is the few people, proportionally speaking, who find my show out of the millions who read these internet articles that do the rounds will maybe consider it and take it on board and consider these stories a bit more. But we're not going to make a difference to it. It's not like we are actually a real court and jury. We're just examining it for our own satisfaction. But anyway, we'll continue with this. So let's bring up to Exhibit H, which is a colorized version of the photo this time. So this is the type. This is what we're talking about. This is the type of way this story is circulating on a daily basis, isn't it?
It is, and over again, it's being repeated. And I am also seeing the rise and then the fall of these social media entities, like a person that I know created War History Online. It had a time where it was sort of the center of gravity, and that time sort of passed, and then somebody else stepped in. And in this case, what is this thing called? Oh yeah, this is sort of a new one, America's Military History. And I believe that's a little bit of a bombastic title because almost everything they post is complete BS. If Your Majesty would push on to Prosecution Exhibit I, which is the following one, I feel like the name of this social media entity is absolutely perfect. Weird Facts, which might be the perfect amalgamation of why we're also fascinated with the Yang Kyoungjong story to this day. It's just plain a weird fact. And it is this process of reification and repeating that is occurring, and it explodes through and tears through the social media thunderdome on a regular basis to the point where all of my uncles forward this to me constantly, to the point where I'm like, I'm going to go drown myself in the lake today. I can't take it anymore. All of my uncles will forward Yang Kyoungjong to me and go, did you know about this? And I just want to give up as a result of it. But it says something very important about this age we live in now, doesn't it? It says something very important about the way we have to be so concerned with the way that mythology and folklore can now spread like wildfire in ways that they simply couldn't during the analog era.
And it's also without me being a computer, social media, internet expert, it's the power that something has to take hold. These weeds, the ivy metaphor again, is that if I publish a bad book or I write a bad book and it ends up on shelves and libraries, it's reached a certain amount of distribution, so we say. But on the internet, the way it works and the way Google works, the way the ranking works, is that the more things that source it and then double back on it and link back there, the power that generates is that it can push real stories or potentially fake stories, can push real stories out of the way, and it just spreads and spreads and spreads around the world on its own without anybody behind it, because of the algorithm, the magic algorithm that none of us who are YouTube creators understand, and those who are people trying to push social media sites who pay people to try and fool, hoodwink, get an advantage with Google. But these computers, these bots are working all the time, 24 hours a day, on what is generating interest, clickbait, what is receiving hits. And so these stories are just spreading continually. Right now, they're being shared right now while we're talking. This is arriving in people's inboxes. People are looking at this right now.
Why do you want me to be so unhappy? But yes, you're absolutely right. That is precisely the process that's ongoing just now, and it is the dismal tide now, isn't it? And it is rising. It is a process of the superficialization of our historical narrative. And I sound a bit like old man yelling at cloud right now.
Old man yells at clouds.
I feel a bit like that. But this is a process of superficialization where we are distracted into listening to and paying attention to stories that are untrue, like Yang Kyoungjong, to the neglect of stories that are true. And I feel like that is a loss for all of us.
Yeah. No, I mean, in my head, I'm likening it to the James Doohan story. But the James Doohan story, every time I do a Canadian tour, I can pretty much guarantee at some point, Mike and Andrew, I know someone famous is on Juno Beach. Did you know that James Doohan from Star Trek was on? And I understand why people always think they're the first person. Brad from On This Day in Canadian Military History is probably watching. Yes, he probably gets that email 10 times a week. People say, did you know, Brad, that James Doohan, Scotty from Star Trek, was on Juno Beach? And he goes, probably has to go, yes, I know that. But at least that story has a basic truth to it. Sometimes the story gets a little bit mangled and manipulated, the dates get squidged here and there, but the basic story of him being a Canadian soldier in World War II is true. It's a true story doing the rounds, so that's a bit different to a fake story doing the rounds. Not jury that I have yet. I'm not pointing you. I'm not in any direction about this story. I'm just saying that story is a true one. So should we move on to Exhibit J, which I'm intrigued by?
Yes. We've talked a lot about who Yang Kyoungjong was not, but let's now talk a little bit about who he probably was. The map that I have included there is showing you the extent of the Mongol invasions of Western Europe. The map is probably stabilized to around 1279. And I mentioned earlier the idea of that ethnographers have referred to as the Turco-Mongol amalgamation, as it's called, was a process by which Mongolian peoples during the 12th, 13th, 14th century spread all over Central Asia, East Asia, and even West Asia, all the way to the border with Europe. And as a result of that, they did what invading and conquering armies in the past always did, and that is they moved into an area, they defeated their opposition, and they produced offspring with the women that they found there. They ended up in mate bonding, they produced offspring, and it had the effect of spreading Mongolian ancestry far away from Mongolia itself to an area that stretched all the way beyond the Caspian, all the way beyond the Black Sea to the Soviet Transcaucasian republics, and to the front doorstep of Europe. And the reason that it is worth mentioning this is that the process of the 14th century Turco-Mongol amalgamation distributed Asiatic features all the way to the Caucasus, which is why we can end up with Turco-Mongol Georgians. And that's how we can see people with very Mongolian features in the former Soviet republics of Turkestan, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and so forth. And I mention all of this because this story ultimately has a confluence, a collision course with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, of course, is involved as one of the combatant powers of the Second World War. The Soviet Union, as a part of spreading Soviet ideology, became sort of a pan-nationalistic movement, to the extent that you had Soviet socialist republics in the Transcaucasian region and East Asia, and Central Asia. Now, the experience of being Soviet Central Asian republics meant then that the people who lived in Transcaucasia and Soviet Central Asia, that they were subject to Soviet conscription during the Second World War. And the result was then that you had an extremely large number of men from Soviet Central Asia and from the Soviet Transcaucasian republics that served within the ranks of the Red Army. When they did so, they were then ultimately, as a result of warfare, captured by the German army or the German military during the Second World War. You get a large number of them captured from the beginning of Operation Barbarossa all the way to Stalingrad, and a bunch are even being captured during the retreat phase. And that leads us to the next important point of the conversation that inevitably must be had, and that is that you have not just Caucasian Soviet soldiers who become German prisoners, but you had Soviet prisoners who were from the Transcaucasian republics, who were the descendants of the Turco-Mongol amalgamation of the 14th century. And then you also had Soviet prisoners of war who were from Central Asia, from the Central Asian republics. And what that meant then was that when you begin capturing prisoners of war in Normandy, you're going to end up with some Asiatic-looking people. And that's because of these two programs. There are really only two that we need to pay attention to, and that was the program of creating the Eastern Legions, the Ostlegionen, and then also this program that we call HIWI. I always just say HIWI, standing for Hilfswilliger, or volunteer or assistant. I guess it would be a direct translate to volunteer assistant, but it feels like volunteer works better. And as you know, I don't need to tell you these things. You deal with this more than I do. It's the Eastern Legions and the Hiwis they provided opportunities for Soviet prisoners of war to volunteer to either fight with or assist the Wehrmacht during World War II. And so you end up with Eastern battalions in Normandy, and you end up with a very large number of Hiwis in Normandy. And if I could call your honor to now move on to Prosecution Exhibit K, you're seeing a great photograph of prisoners of war in Normandy, aside from the famous Yang Kyoungjong photo, where you're seeing they're obviously exhibiting very strong Central Asian features, where these are men who I believe, look, to the person that might not be familiar with the incredible diversity of the Asian world, if you look at a photo like this, you would, I think, steer a little bit toward Mongolia. Whereas the Yang Kyoungjong photo, he presents some features that look slightly less Mongolian, and just enough for this story of him potentially being Korean. It's enough for it to take root. And
but that's us today with a better understanding of the variety of peoples that we're talking about. I mean, Kurdistan is not even a place your average GI or British Tommy from Manchester would have heard of in 1944. Yet, I'm bringing back the point we raised right at the beginning. Everybody by 1944 knows we're fighting the Japanese. Okay, we're fighting the Japanese in another hemisphere, but we are fighting the Japanese. So that's what. And I want to bring in Dr. Phil Blood, who's on himself on Thursday, talking about the bandit order. I've just going back to his point there because it's really interesting, and I've got to go back and find it because we've got a lot of comments tonight. I can't find it now. Where's Dr. Philip Blood's comment? It's so great that there's lots of people talking. I can't find it now. I had it a minute ago, and then there we go. There is a note on a British intelligence file from May 1944. It's not much, but it says the claims that Japanese soldiers are in the area is an incorrect identification. So that's interesting. Marty's eyes pricked up at that, Dr. Phil. So can you send that quote thing where you got that through? Because that's a really interesting little extra bit of evidence that I would ask the jury to consider. The learned Dr. Philip Blood is a very credible witness. I will get that across to people.
Thank you for that, Dr. Phil, because that's useful. Because I have also this document. I didn't submit it as a part of discovery as a prosecution exhibit, but it's worth mentioning. There is a statement that goes from. Would it be so? If it's June 44, is he still General Montgomery or is he Field Marshal Montgomery yet? He's still General Montgomery, right?
General, yeah.
He's not Field Marshal yet. General Montgomery submits a brief report to General Eisenhower, during which he is generally speaking to the success of the ground forces in Normandy so far. And he mentions himself Japanese prisoners being captured in Normandy. So even the figure of Bernard Law Montgomery himself was of the belief. And General Montgomery was also, like Robert Brewer, not an ethnographer. And in order to make sense of all of this, you functionally have to become very intimate with ethnographic information from the 14th century, the era of the Golden Horde, in order to understand who these people were and who this person might have been. And I found myself just the other day, I was describing this to someone, and I mentioned particularly that within the Ostlegionen in Normandy, there was a Turkestani battalion. In fact, we think there were probably more than one. And there were also Turkestani Hiwis. And I mentioned to this person, and they said, oh, so there were Turkish people there. And I was like, it's much more complicated than that, because Turkestanis, they live east of the Caspian, and Turks live west of the Caspian, and they're ethnographically very different. I think if you were Turkish and somebody mistook you for a Turkestani, that would be like somebody looking at me and saying, oh, you're from the South. Are you from Tennessee? And I would be, good God, no, I'm not from Tennessee, for Christ's sake. I'm an Alabamian. Don't make that mistake. We're totally different. Whereas outsiders would think you're all Southerners. And a point I should also issue here is that I think the reason that we hear wild things like Japanese prisoners or Korean prisoners is because there would have been a little bit of racial condescension for a world that wasn't nearly as enlightened as the world that we live in today, a world where, as a result of our digital universe, we can access information to understand the great diversity that existed among Asian people. And the reality, I think, was that World War II was fought by a lot of people who weren't ethnographers, and they weren't particularly well educated when it comes to ethnographic information, and they made mistakes, which is entirely human. I'm not criticizing them. I'm just saying that when Bernard Law Montgomery says they were Japanese, it doesn't mean that they were Japanese.
Yeah. And let's go back to that original. I'm going to put Exhibit A up again just because I want to. Let's go back to the Exhibit B, in fact. This original caption that's trying to make a statement for people in the to read it then in 1944 to make an impact on them. So I think maybe by using Japanese, they're suggesting to the reader of that in whatever journal that's going to appear in, newspaper, magazine, that, you know, there are enemy everywhere. Our fight is not over yet. Buy more war bonds. Get behind your troops because the spread of evil is everywhere because there are even Japanese people. No, that's kind of the intention there. It's not in any way trying to be a balanced understanding of the ethnicities that are being faced by Allied soldiers on a daily basis, conquesting their way through Europe. It's just simply to get a reaction, immediate reaction of, folks, there's lots of enemies out there that we need to overcome before this war is over. Do you agree with me on that, Marty?
Absolutely. And that's a dimension that I have heretofore not fully considered. And I thank you for offering that, because that has not informed the way that I look at that caption. And it does make sense that the United States is attempting to convince people we can win this fight, but we've got a long, hard fight to go. And look, the Germans now have Japanese fighting alongside of them. There's proof that this is a worldwide conspiracy that we all must get behind completely. We must devote ourselves to. And
because we understand now that once it's close of play on June the 6th, the Allies are going to defeat the Germans. It's just a matter of time and how many losses going. The risk is more or less gone. People say, "Oh no, there's still things they can do," but let's take it that pretty much the risk is gone. But for the public to keep dipping into their pockets for war bonds, to keep sending their loved ones motivating letters, to keep on doing all that, the peril still has to be. We don't want to take our foot off the gas. We don't want to let the public know that actually things are calming down a bit. We're over the main hurdles now. We've got, now is the time to convince the general public that to put more effort in. Let's not let's not slow down now. We've got to defeat this enemy. They're still entrenched. They're going to be defending their homeland soon. So I think I'm going to stick with my idea of that's what the intention was. Just not to give people fear, but to remind them of what's still ahead.
Yeah, sort of a solemn recommitment to the idea of pursuing this conflict to its inevitable end.
Yeah, definitely. So let's move on to Exhibit L, which you referenced earlier on. So that's Le Hay Depuis, and this is the Engineer Brigade people. Again, interesting folks there, because I've always found that photo interesting, because you've got very few photos really of British and American or Commonwealth and American photos, troops in the same photos in Normandy. We tended to send our photographers to our separate campaigns, and photos are either American or British or Canadian. But this is one where you got a bit of everything there.
Yeah.
So what are we looking at here?
Well, it's very interesting that we're looking at an obviously Turkestani Hiwi, and just. Before continuing on, I should definitely mention that much of my work would not have been possible were it not for the expertise and assistance of Niels Henkman, who, like you, is one of the greatest living thinkers on this subject matter. And he has been great in assisting me. And he pointed out that he sent me some additional research about the extent to which Turkestanis were functioning as Hiwis within the German 353rd Division, which is a division that participated in the fighting around La Haye Depuis. And the documents that he shared with me very interestingly indicated that the Turkestanis were being used as volunteers within that division as horse groomers or as farriers. And I find that fascinating, because that definitely contributes an interesting level of continued thought on this idea of the German military and the extent to which it depended on horses for transport. When you're a military that moves around for the most part using horses, you're going to need a lot of people that are functioning as horse groomers and farriers. And the Turkestanis and the Mongolians had extensive experience as horsemen. And so it seems like a very natural fit that you have hauled in a massive quantity of Turkestanis and Azerbaijanis and Kazakhs and Uzbeks, and Mongolians, and that those people, that those individuals were very experienced horsemen, and you have a modern army that has a lot of horses associated with it, and you need those people to bring that level of assistance, and you don't want to employ them in combat arms battalions. And so what do? You have them taking care of the horses. I believe that the person in the photograph here, I shouldn't say that I believe it, it's Nils and I mutually agree on this. It was mainly his idea that we're looking at a Turkestani farrier that was associated with 353rd Division. And in this photograph, he is being interrogated. And there are war correspondents that are sitting there jotting down notes about his experience. And what I would call the court's attention to is the fact that this idea of Yang Kyoungjong, the Korean, being the person in the photograph, has big problems because it overlooks the fact that an extremely large number of former Soviet prisoners from the Soviet Transcaucasian republics and former Soviet prisoners from the Soviet Central Asian republics were serving in the German military during the Normandy battle. This is a great piece of evidence that reinforces the idea that what we might be dealing with is not this far-fetched and exaggerated story that eventually a motion picture will be built on, but that what we're dealing with is something somewhat more pedestrian and mundane than that. And it might just be that we're dealing with a Turkestani who was captured by the Germans after his service in the Soviet military, and he was employed by the German military to take care of the horses.
No, definitely. And we've got a second photo in the same series. This is Exhibit M, which you put the insignia over the top there. So a slightly different angle with the war monument in the back there, and a little bit more of his face, face in view there, so we can get a bit more of an understanding of you
can see that right shoulder patch. Now, granted, I can't see it closely enough to see if it says Turkestani, or if it says Azerbaijan or Uzbek or Kazakh. Regardless, though, that is a man whose facial appearances were shaped by the Turco-Mongol amalgamation of the 14th century. That is a man who came by his service in the German military as a result of his previous service in the Soviet military. And that is a man who was plucked from either the Soviet Transcaucasian republics or the Soviet Central Asian republics to serve. And here he is in Normandy, a prisoner of the Americans.
Yeah. Brilliant photo. Exhibit N. Another prisoner, or two prisoners.
And I offer this to the court because it furthers this idea that there were a large number of Central Asians and people from Transcaucasia who were serving in uniform in the German military in World War II. In leading tours to Normandy for the last 20 or so years of my life, I have found overwhelmingly that people are surprised to learn that there were so many foreign nationals serving in German uniform in Normandy. And here we're seeing a couple of them in this big prisoner of war pen after Falaise. And it supports this idea that we had people from Transcaucasia and from the former Soviet Central Asian republics that were serving not just as Hiwis within existing German military units, but also serving within Eastern battalions. We're more familiar with, there was a Cossack battalion, what was it, the 439th fighting around Kirintan. There was the Georgian 795th Battalion fighting in the vicinity of Utah Beach. There was an entire Turkmen battalion that was serving in the area that would be east of Sword Beach, in the area of, Trouville? That was the Turkmenistan.
Deauville, yeah.
The Turkmenistani 781st Battalion. So we had volunteers serving within existing German units, as well as these Eastern battalions that were stocked full of Cossacks, which would be Ukrainians and Georgians and Azerbaijanis and Turkmenistanis. And all of these people who had been affected by this 14th century process by which the Golden Horde spread Asiatic physical features to people all the way to the Black Sea. And it feels very irresponsible for an historian to have rushed to this conclusion that they were Korean. And as we now know, Stephen Ambrose didn't really arrive at that conclusion as a result of his own research and his own effort. He just sort of took Brewer's word for it. Brewer had left a personal account where he mentioned Korean. Ambrose repeated it, and the rest, as we say, has been history.
Yeah. And we'll move to, it should say Exhibit O, but I didn't change the caption. It still says Exhibit N again, but it's Exhibit O. And this is, what you explained, this map of where these photos are taken. So the whole of, there is definitely, it's a simple point, but I'll remind the jury, there are definitely troops of varying levels and types of Asiatic appearance in Normandy. That is a given. We know there are people who certainly, to the average American, British, or Canadian soldier, would appear to be of Asiatic origin. We can now look at the differences and say, yes, there's more of a Mongolian look there. This is more Central Asia. But for your average person there is definitely the fact they would see people who are Asian in appearance. That's a given, isn't it?
Absolutely, it is a given. And I would call Your Honor's attention to the fact that if you look at the two images that I have indicating Trouville-sur-Mer, those are Turkistanis that were serving in the 781st Turkistani Battalion, which was an Eastern battalion. And I have situated these photos geographically in an effort to simply convince the court that there were men with Asian features serving in German uniforms across all of Normandy from the beginning of the campaign on June 6th to the final end of the campaign with the Falaise encirclement. And it is not entirely accurate for us to assume that the man was Korean. There's a possibility that he could have had some Korean ethnicity because of the fact that what we now know also that there were Koreans living in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, in Ukraine at the time of the era of the Soviet purges, and that during this diaspora that occurred, that it was occasioned by the era of the Stalinistic purges in the years preceding the Second World War, that Stalin forced them away, that he forced them from where they were living. We believe that there were about 330,000 people of Korean ancestry living in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Ukraine. And that as a result of the Stalinistic diaspora created by forced collectivization and the ongoing use of minority ethnic groups by the Stalinist Soviet Union for agriculture, that they got sort of spread all over the Soviet universe. And we know that there were some out there, and that creates the possibility that a person of Korean ancestry might have ended up in the Soviet military and might have therefore ended up captured by the Germans. But the likelihood that I believe is more convincing is that what we're looking at in the famous Yang Kyoungjong photograph is a person who was Turkistani, a person whose facial features were crafted by the 14th century Turco-Mongol amalgamation. And if it pleased the court, I would offer that Yang Kyoungjong is a person who never existed, because he certainly never left us any proof that he ever existed. And with that, the prosecution rests.
Well, thank you very much. I think I know you've presented a very strong case. I will now kind of put it to the jury to consider these points. So let's recap. As a judge, I will kind of sum things up. So we have the Korean embassy have not found no trace of this individual at all. Historically, no one can really come up with a plausible reason why there was even one Korean in Normandy. That it just doesn't. Connecting the dots, all these other units of varying types, there are genuine reasons for them to be there. But Koreans in Normandy, we just can't seem to make those dots connect. We have a very sketchy original account based on a very sketchy account by Robert Brewer, turned into a paragraph that is very vague in Stephen Ambrose's book. And that's really all we have. And we have this photo. And with only one photo, and we don't know, is he tired? Is he looking up? Has he just rubbed his eyes? We don't know. There's lots. If we had a range of photos of this same individual with different expressions, there'd be maybe something more to work on there. But one photo, you can't make a summer with one. One swallow does not a summer make. I don't think we can draw too many conclusions from that. So, folks, I'm going to put it out to you now. Give in the comments there. Do we think there was a Korean soldier on Omaha Beach? It's a very simple yes or no. So, yes, this photo depicts a Korean on Omaha Beach, or no, he doesn't. And I'll let you. Me and Marty will kind of just talk amongst ourselves for a couple of minutes and see what happens in the sidebar there. It's fascinating. I mean, what you got me thinking about also is when these various interrogations were done, I wonder what common language was found, because to communicate, and how that may have muddied the water, because I don't know how many Allied soldiers spoke all the varying dialects. So when they're speaking to someone who's serving with are they using German? Are they using kind of a Russian language? Are they using Chinese? I would wonder where they're finding any kind of common ability to communicate, and whether that's influencing, when they're writing things down, what the nationality of the person interviewing might be.
I think your question further undermines these ideas of him being Korean, because if he was Korean, there's not a chance in hell that somebody would be able to translate for him. However, if he was born in one of the Soviet Central Asian republics or Transcaucasia, he probably would have had a basis of the Russian language.
Yeah.
And that on that basis, there would have been an ability to communicate. Yeah. And that's why that's another method that I am using to dismiss this absurdity of him being Korean. He might be of Korean ancestry, but this is a Soviet citizen in German uniform. That's what this is. And they would not have been able to communicate with him were it otherwise. Whereas you have an American there, who with obvious Caucasian features, who's interrogating him. Clearly he's being interrogated. And there were plenty of Russian-speaking Americans during the Second World War that might have been able to, through some pidgin Russian, been able to like carve out the basics of his service as a part of this prisoner of war interrogation. But if he was Korean, of knowing who he was.
Right. Well, I'm counting up roughly, because don't forget, this is not an official court. There's no actual verdict being delivered. It's about 40 no's and 1 yes. So,
wow, it's far better than I expected.
It's fairly unanimous.
And the one yes, I would like to go, why do you believe that?
I can go back and ask. It is. Where's the person who said yes?
Are you going to dox him? Or are you going to name shame him?
I'm not going to name shame him now. But the person who said yes, one of you said yes. I wonder why. Just to be contrary. I think if I was watching, I might do it just to be contrary. But I think there is no real case. We're not bringing anybody to trial. Stephen Ambrose is not here. The person who put this Wikipedia entry into the ether is not here. We're not changing anything here. What we are doing is, I think we're reminding ourselves, all of us, to not take anything that we read at face value, is to double check and look at the origins of things. And when these cool stories come up that seem amazing, there's maybe a reason why they surfaced 60 years after war and hadn't surfaced before, is because they aren't maybe quite what they purport to be. And someone has gone, this is a good little crack there. And the fact you suggested this might even have just been a prank, I think, is really fascinating, because normally when there's some kind of deception involved, there's some kind of end result someone is wanting. It's usually financial. The Hitler diaries, the Jack the Ripper diaries, something. There's usually a financial gain to be had. The fake German accounts, the in the book, the D-Day through German eyes, whoever's behind that has made a shitload of money out of World War II, more than you, I, Niels, Dr. Phil, everybody else watching this put together times 10. Whoever is behind that bit of bound toilet paper. So if this was just a prank, it makes it really interesting as what the reason, if that was the real reason.
Yeah, and I threw the word prank out because I'm left with question marks. I'm puzzled by this, because why would this Wikipedia page be created when there is absolutely, positively, and definitely no basis of reality for that Wikipedia page? There's no proof. There's nothing on the death record. There's no census record whatsoever indicating that a person named Yang Kyoungjong lived in the Chicago area or died in the Chicago area. So I get you. I hear you loud and clear. Financial motives and incentives will drive people. However, I have sort of found that in this world of digital vandalism that we live, I think there are some people that thrive on chaos alone.
Yeah, no, definitely. And if there's myself doing this, there's Robbie watching from his military history channel, there's Brad watching from his channel. We're chipping away as in our various levels of success, trying to do real history. And there are these other channels that are getting insane views, talking about the same old stuff that has either been either there's no value in it because it's all been said a million times before, or they are, in some cases, twisting these ideas of untold this, the secret mystery of that, and it's a shame. It's a shame. People are very interested in what appears to be new stuff, and often there isn't that much new stuff out there. Some people are undecided, which is interesting. So there's some people still. Phil Blood is saying history is dying. Don't say that, Phil. Don't get me all depressed, Phil. I think we just have to keep on going, don't we, Phil? But the verdict, the one verdict that is definitely the case is people want you back, Marty, either to do another one of these or to do the Hemavez show we've been talking about doing for a long time, which would kind of connect in some ways to the Grania show. But Hemavez, if you want to say it the French way, Mag is watching. Mag always likes how well you say the words in French. You know, you're in with Mag there. Mag thinks you're great for going Memorial de Caen, all that. So yeah, that's great. So we will do that. We will do that at some point. You're welcome whenever you want. So we'll do another Normandy Myth Busters. But the judge is summing up today by saying the case closed. There was no Korean on Omaha Beach. As far as the World War II TV audience has been decided, it's not quite unanimous, but I'm siding with the. I need to get a gavel. I'll get my glasses. Case closed. There was no Korean on Omaha Beach. So. Marty, we might tell us what you're up to now. Are you going to be back in Normandy anytime soon, or?
Why, yes. By coincidence, I'll be there in about 2 weeks. I'm coming back. I continue to lead tours for Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours and National Geographic. I was thrilled back in June when I was able to come back for the first time since the COVID lockdown. I had missed Normandy very much. In 2020, when I failed to go for the anniversary of D-Day, it was the first time in almost 25 years that I wasn't in Normandy for the anniversary, and that was weird. So it's great to be back leading tours to Normandy and taking people around to those sites. I'm also I continue to write, just turned in a big article about the Operation Torch landings because the 80th anniversary of that is coming up. Just finished a big article about Guadalcanal because we're going through the 80th anniversary of that right now. And just finished doing a big TV series about the period of when we still belonged to the United Kingdom, and there was a
your better era, I believe.
Better era, obviously. Yeah, clearly. I just finished this big
golden years, as we like to call it.
Yeah, I just did this big series when the colonial frontier stretched up to the Ohio River, and that was kind of fun. It's a different subject area, but it was fun to be involved in that. But man, I'm knee deep in World War II history, and I suppose I always will be.
Well, I think that's the guilty as charged. Lock me up. That's not going to go away. So, Marty, hopefully I'll bump into you in a couple of weeks' time. And if not, we'll bump into each other virtually doing one of these. So, great. I'm just going to take you off screen for a second, bring you back in a moment. So, no show tomorrow. Wednesday, we're talking about the 80th anniversary of the Makin Island raid by Marine Raiders. That'll be really cool with John Bernstein. Thursday, Dr. Phil Blood is coming on to talk about the anti-partisan order that was Hitler first kind of brought up in August 1942, so 80 years ago. And then Friday, more stuff coming your way. I've temporarily forgotten what we've got coming up on Friday. It'll come back to me later because I'm still going through this whole Korean soldier on Omaha Beach. Forgive me for forgetting things. But don't forget, folks, like what we're doing, share what we're doing on social media. I'm going to bring Marty back in base to say goodbye. So we will meet again either in person or virtually. Thank everybody for watching. It's been fantastic. I've enjoyed the fact that we did this little slightly different format, and we will do it again. So cheers, everybody. See you next time. Bye.